For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. United States national parks are nature's grand masterpiece, a testament to the awe-inspiring beauty our world offers. Each park is a symphony of colors, textures, and landscapes, a canvas painted by the hands of time and shaped by the forces of nature. From the towering cliffs of Yosemite to the scorching desert terrain of Death Valley, these parks are living galleries that showcase the Earth's extraordinary diversity. Yet within their breathtaking beauty lies a subtle reminder of nature's power and unpredictability. The danger that accompanies this magnificence serves as a humbling reminder that we are merely visitors in this untamed realm. The wilderness can be both a sanctuary and a challenge, inviting us to explore its depths with caution and respect. These parks are a living chronicle of our planet's history, a sanctuary for the preservation of its wonders. We are entrusted with safeguarding these national treasures, ensuring they remain pristine and unspoiled for generations yet to come. In their presence, we find inspiration to explore, learn, and marvel at the intricate tapestry of existence that surrounds us. So let us step into the heart of these natural wonders with gratitude in our hearts and reverence in our souls. Let us embrace both the breathtaking beauty and the humbling danger, for in their union, we discover a profound reflection of our own place within the intricate web of life. National parks are not only landscapes of wonder, but also mirrors that reflect the depths of our connection to the world around us. However, it's essential to grasp that alongside the mesmerizing beauty, a genuine peril awaits if we fail to honor the might of Mother Nature. Please click the subscribe and like buttons. This is Outdoor Disasters, National Park Disasters Marathon number 1. For one group of hikers, their Yosemite excursion would be one of the worst disasters in the park's history. Half Dome is a Yosemite icon and a great challenge to many hikers. Thousands of people reach the summit each year. For most, it is an exciting, arduous hike. For a few, it becomes more of an adventure than they wanted. Indeed, park rangers assist hundreds of people on the Half Dome Trail every summer. Much of the hike to Half Dome is an adventure into wilderness, and while there is nothing you can do to guarantee your safety, but that was the thrill co-workers and close friends Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban lived for. Regular outdoor companions, Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban headed a party that would attempt the 16-mile round-trip hike to summit Half Dome. Esteban had recruited another work friend, Bill Pippi, and his work supervisor, Bob Frith, to join. Frith, in turn, had invited his best friend, Bruce Weiner. Both were East Coast transplants and have recently arrived in California. Bill Pippi invited 16-year-old twin brothers, Bruce and Brian Jordan. Rounding out the group was co-worker Carl Buckner, who in turn invited his best friend Steve Elner. The Rice-Esteban group awoke to a crystal-clear summer sky, ready for a full day of hiking to conquer the famed granite monolith. The caravan entered Yosemite Valley. Being Bruce Weiner's first time, he was awestruck by Yosemite Valley. The monstrous granite cliffs towered high over the valley like looming giants. Entering Yosemite Valley is breathtaking as you gaze up at the mile sheer from the valley floor. Then there it was, Half Dome and its distinct features. One side is a sheer face, while the other three sides are smooth and round, making it appear like a dome cut in half. It's the star of the valley, towering nearly 5,000 feet from the valley floor. Weiner had difficulty visualizing himself atop the overpowering mountain and wondered silently if he could really accomplish such a feat. They had a buffet breakfast at the cafeteria at Camp Curry, then loaded their backpacks with gear, clothing, and food. It was a 2-mile march to the trailhead at Happy Isles. The sky was blue when the group headed out, except for a single cumulus cloud floating above. By the time they reached Vernal Fall, a few cumuli of clouds had formed in the sky to the east. As the hike went on, Buckner and Elner fell behind and were a good 30 minutes behind the group. Rice, Esteban, Pippi, and the Jordan twins were ahead. Frith and Weiner arrived shortly after. Around 12:30 p.m. to cool off after a rigorous first half of the hike, they dove into the chill water upriver from Nevada Fall. They hooted, shouted, and yelled obscenities while tussling like schoolboys to push each other off. All the while, several cumulus clouds in the eastern skies now had combined and were massing over, and rumblings could be heard in the distance around Cloud's Rest. The threatening weather prompted Tom Rice and his party to pack up. Rice and Esteban assured the others once they were on the summit, they would be safe and dry in the cave if a thunderstorm hit. Pippi and Bruce Jordan were setting a furious pace, hoping to outrace the coming storm. Close behind, Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban made a quick stop at their secret spring. Brian Jordan soon joined them. Back at Nevada Falls, Weiner and Frith were falling behind. Carrying a 45-pound backpack, they'd been behind the other 5 for most of the trip. As exhausted as they were, they plodded ahead anyways. But as they went on, Weiner's muscles began to cramp. They gulped the last of their water. Weiner wanted to take a longer rest, but Frith urged him to push on and catch up with the others. Bill Pippi and Bruce Jordan were shooting to reach the top first. Both were competitive and in good shape. So despite the intimidating weather, the two raced ahead. Unfortunately for Pippi, he had an undeniable sensation to relieve himself of feces, so they headed back to find a place for Pippi. Esteban, Rice, and Brian Jordan were not far behind. As they were ascending, 2 hikers coming down warned them not to go up as the storm was coming. Rather, the warning enticed them to pick up the pace and reach the summit. Buckner and Elner were still very far behind, but continued plodding along, even after the threat of the lightning storm. Well ahead of their companions, Esteban and Rice reached the bottom of the cables at 5:40 p.m. as the dark clouds blanketed the sky. Lightning continued playing over the ridges and spires, and the thunder rumbled like battleship guns nearby. At the base of the cables, there's a sign warning hikers of ascending the mountain during a lightning storm. Half Dome is notorious for lightning strikes. Its smooth granite surface makes for an excellent conductor of electricity. They now had to weigh their next move. The threat of lightning would spur them on. At the top, they'd reach shelter in the form of a cave where they could hide from the storm. While a lightning bolt might possibly strike the granite slop near them, or even hit the cables they would be clinging to, a strike higher up was far more likely. What they didn't factor in was a strike could streak anywhere on wet surfaces. Any place on the mountain would be dangerous if Half Dome were coated with water. As Esteban looked up and analyzed the sky, he felt a drizzle on his face. Torrential rain wasn't far off. They figured this storm was no different from past hazards they have encountered over the years. The two exchanged a glance and knew the decision had been made. "Screw it, this is our mountain, let's just do it," Rice said. Esteban agreed. Despite the looming storm and the warning, they forged on and ascended the cables 600 feet away from the summit, shrouded in mist. Rice moved rapidly toward the cables, with Esteban immediately behind him. As if cued by their movements, a mosaic of jagged lightning streaked the sky, followed by rolling claps. A sense of foreboding overtook Esteban, which prompted him to say, "Whatever happens, I want you to know I love you." Meanwhile, Jordan split from the other group, content to hike at his own pace. Eager to impress the older men, he followed in Rice and Esteban's footsteps, without a second thought. Further back were Frith and Weiner. The warning sign at the base of the subdome stared at them as they approached the cables. A concerned Weiner wondered aloud if they should stop and wait out the storm. Frith assured him that refuge was in a cave that awaited them at the summit. He doubted he could make it up, but he figured his muscle would tighten further if he delayed further. As a newcomer, he didn't want to hold anyone back. They caught a glimpse of Rice and Esteban nearing the summit just as clouds unleashed pouring rain. Frith and Weiner put on their ponchos and began ascending the cables to the summit. As Rice and Esteban reached the summit around 6 p.m., they were still aware of their vulnerability. Lightning would strike the dome, it was only a matter of when. They dashed across the summit toward the cave. "We made it!" they yelled jubilantly and high-fived each other. Minutes later, they saw Brian Jordan standing at the summit. Esteban waved him urgently towards the cave. As Brian hustled over, Frith and Weiner appeared at the summit and waved them in as well. "Bring on the lightning show!" they yelled as they settled down in the cave. All were proud of what they had accomplished and were beaming with joy. At this time, the rain turned colder. Hailstones began clattering on the rocks. The 5 huddled inside the cave, looking to generate some heat. Meanwhile, Bill Pippi and Bruce Jordan had wisely stayed below subdome after Bruce said he was afraid of the lightning storm. Pippi, now dehydrated and severely weakened from diarrhea, They decided to head to base camp, where they pitched their tent and hunkered down at around 6:15 p.m. Back at the cave, the eerie lightning tracers glowed inside, casting ghostly hues. In an instant, the cave exploded with a cataclysmic roar as lightning ripped across its surfaces. Esteban was slammed against the wall. He screamed but didn't hear his voice. Everything grew dark. He was numb and couldn't move. Electricity had entered his body. Because he had limited contact with the granite, had confined the charge to the left side of his body, and was lucky he didn't get the full effect of the strike. Weiner was also lucky, bending to adjust his laces. He was only touching the wall with his rear and thighs, but he had no feeling from the waist down and was moaning in pain. But he was the most coherent of the group. Weiner turned to look at Brian Jordan, whose eyes were vacant. In shock, he says, "We've got to get out of here." Turning to scan the cave, he saw Rice slouch sideways against the granite wall in a fetal position with his body jerking and twitching. His bare legs were badly charred, and his blonde hair was blackened. As Esteban came to, he looked over at Brian Jordan, slumped forward, smelling of burning flesh. He appeared lifeless. With sickening clarity, Esteban now saw that he and Rice put everyone at risk. Pulling himself with his paralyzed legs behind, he was horrified at what he saw. Firth was vomiting and froth gurgling from his mouth, eyes rolled back and showing their whites. His forehead bore a gash as if someone had plunged a white-hot dagger into his skull. His body was thrashing and threatened to catapult himself off the ledge. Esteban managed to snag his waistband and pulled him back from the lip, but his body continued to convulse toward the edge as though he was seeking the void beyond. Esteban strained to hold on and yelled for help. Weiner, seeing his friend in peril, managed to grab Frith's sweater. Together, they pulled Frith back. But with both paralyzed from the waist down, they couldn't exert enough leverage. They couldn't control his violent convulsions and were in danger to go over the ledge as well. Weiner desperately held on as Esteban let go. Frith, convulsing, slid farther and was yanking Weiner closer to the edge as well. Weiner had no choice but to let go. In horror, he and Esteban watched as Frith disappeared over the precipice, to the rocks 2,200 feet below. Weiner screamed and began to sob. Devastated by the tragedy, Esteban looks over at Rice, whose left leg was twisted beneath a dislodged rock. He was making unintelligible noises and was gagging on regurgitated broccoli. He cleared his mouth and shook him in a vain attempt to restore consciousness. Severe burns scorched Rice's legs and were still smoking as atmospheric crackling sounded outside. Esteban was petrified and screamed to Weiner, "We've to get the hell out of here." Weiner tried to stand but fell back down. Esteban was convinced they were in mortal peril and could only think of escape. With all his upper body strength, he crawled his way to the tunnel entrance and onto the summit. His sights were set on a crevice called the outhouse that was about 150 feet away. Crawling frantically, he reached the depression. Giddy with relief, Esteban blended tears with shrill laughter as he was alive. And for the moment, that was all that mattered. Back at the cave, Weiner was shaken to the core by the disaster that had befallen him and his companions. He could have mustered enough strength to scramble out of the cave, but getting down the cable with an immobilized leg was unthinkable, and he wanted no part of being out there on the bare summit as a human lightning rod. So he prayed another strike wouldn't happen and stayed put. Buzzing and crackling suddenly filled the air. He had no time to budge before another blinding explosion blasted the granite and ripped through the cave. Weiner immediately found himself floating as he was having an out-of-body experience, watching his body convulse and then slowly sink into a relaxed state. He felt an excruciating pain in his chest. He lay motionless, the charred remnant of his shirt stuck to his exposed skin. Searing pain shot through his legs whenever he moved. The hiking boot on his left leg had been completely blown off. Rice gradually regained consciousness as if the jolt had recharged his brain. He screamed in agony from the weight of Weiner's body on his leg. Rice's other leg was bent grotesquely under a rock. Weiner rolled off him. Next to them was Brian Jordan, his face bluish, his body slumped over. Weiner began to yell for help. The clouds began to pass over, and only faint rumblings of thunder persisted from afar. In this part of Yosemite, the storm was over. Esteban, believing the danger had subsided, left the crevice and began crawling back up to the slope toward the cave. Esteban saw someone coming over the ridge at the top of the cables. He waved his arms to attract the hiker's attention. This hiker was Mike Hoog. who was a trained EMT. As Hug entered the cave, he saw the disaster that engulfed the hiking party. The odor of burned hair and flesh hung in the air. He scurried over the worst off, who was Brian Jordan. He had no pulse and was dead. He then attended to Rice and Weiner. Esteban, who now had full use of his legs, approached the cave to assist. When Rice saw him, he yelled, "Adrian, get your ass in here and get me out. Don't leave me behind to die like you did." Hug and Esteban carried the two out of the cave onto the open granite and laid them on the ground, both moaning and squirming in pain. Others from the group Hug was hiking with made it up to the summit and assisted the injured hiker, which included Linda Cozier, an EMT trainer. Confident Linda and the others could handle injured Rice and Weiner, Hogg figured that him being a long-distance runner should be the person to run for help. With the storm past, Pippi and Bruce Jordan were ready to make their ascent, and were back at the cables. Carl Buckner and Steve Elner finally arrived at the cables as well. They regrouped and repacked their backpacks and were beginning to start their ascent when they encountered a frenzied Hug dashing down. Hikers had been hit by lightning up on top. "I'm going for help," he blurted out. "That's it, I'm not going any farther, I'm out of here," Elner said. He headed back down. Pippi initially thought the hiker meant the strike had occurred some time ago and refused to believe the incident involved anyone in his group. "I simply blocked that notion out of my mind," he later stated. On the cables, they encountered another hurried hiker coming down. Two guys got killed and one was a young kid. Those words stunned Buckner, Pippi, and Bruce Jordan, thinking it could have been Bruce's brother who was killed. In silence, the three continued their climb, the full weight of the unfolding tragedy now hanging over them. As Pippi, Buckner, and Jordan arrived at the summit, they saw Rice. Rice shouted, "The kid's dead. Frith fell over the edge." When Buckner heard this, he couldn't handle it, so he retreated down the cables to the base camp to meet Elner. They didn't sleep much as each attempted to digest the horrifying news about their comrades. As Pippi and Bruce Jordan reached others, Pippi was in disbelief. Bruce just stared blankly as if the reality of his deceased brother hadn't hit him yet. It was 8:45 p.m. and darkness was settling over Yosemite Valley. All the activity of caring for the injured hikers was happening just feet from the precipice of the sheer rock face of Half Dome. Linda Cozier was leading the triage on top of the summit, trying desperately to attend to Weiner and Rice's injuries as best as she could. Pippi was inconsolable as he felt guilty for the death of Brian, who was in his care. Around 9:30 p.m., Mike Hug reached a ranger station and informed them of the situation unfolding on top of Half Dome. The rangers packed up their supplies and headed up to Half Dome on foot. While a helicopter was considered, it was dark and very dangerous for flying at low altitudes. Without sufficient moonlight, it wouldn't be possible. But around 11 p.m., the moonlight broke through, spurring the rangers to dispatch a helicopter from Modesto. As the rangers who were on foot reached the summit of Half Dome, they were briefed about the situation by Linda. The group was informed about the coming helicopter and set out to find a suitable landing zone on the summit. Just around midnight, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotor blades grew louder and louder. The rangers gathered flashlights and used them as an LZ marker, positioning them in a circle. Time was crucial for the rescue, as if the moonlight vanished, the helicopter might be stuck on the summit overnight. As the helicopter reached the summit, it could only take one patient at a time. It was decided that Weiner was the worse off and needed immediate attention, and was the first to be evacuated down to the valley. Around 1:15 a.m., the helicopter returned for Rice, and he also was flown down. And the last person to be evacuated was Esteban, who didn't need a stretcher like the other two. It was determined Rice and Weiner's injuries required specialized care at a major trauma center and were flown to UC Davis Medical Center. Back on the summit of Half Dome, the remaining hikers were spent mentally, physically, and psychologically. There was a strong sense of cohesiveness and mutual affection amongst the group, including the other hikers that stepped in to assist. Remaining on the summit from the Esteban Rice party were Bill Pippi and Bruce Jordan, who was battling with despair as the body of Brian lay in the cave just feet away. Linda Cozier, Mike Hug, and their party remained on the summit as well. Around 6:30 a.m., A Yosemite National Park helicopter lifted off to retrieve the bodies of Bob Rith and Brian Jordan. They flew to the base of Half Dome and located Frith among the rocks, then flew to the summit to retrieve the body of Brian Jordan. Bruce got in the helicopter with the body of his brother. Shortly after, Pippi hiked down to where Carl Buckner and Steve Elner were camping, and the three trudged back down to the valley. When Pippi arrived at the ranger station, Bruce and Brian's parents were there, which made Pippi again inconsolable as he broke down crying. Mr. Jordan's attempts to comfort Bill Pippi helped him considerably. Unaware of the events that led to the tragedy, the Jordans held Yosemite officials responsible for the disaster at Half Dome and wondered how they allowed hikers to scale Half Dome despite the hazardous weather. Linda Crozier and another member of her party, Brian Cage, gave their statements to the Rangers on what occurred. Cage stated, "That's when it really hit me. As much as this was an accident caused by a combination of Mother Nature and poor human judgment, there remained a looming wrongful death lawsuit against Yosemite. I remember the ranger commenting that a big money lawsuit could easily consume the entire budget, the park allots for making Half Dome and other backcountry destinations accessible." Cage told the ranger they were prepared to testify that the accident happened because the 5 men in the cave had been reckless. Esteban himself had stated as much, so the Jordans were advised to not pursue a lawsuit, as it would likely be dismissed. Esteban struggled with the fact his and Rice's action caused the death of 2 people and 1 is seriously injured. He also struggled with the accusation by Rice that he abandoned him. "The dilemma I faced, do all I could to save someone else and let myself possibly die, or save myself and let someone else possibly die," he said. Fleeing the cave for safety of the 5 hikers, he endured the catastrophe with no major injuries. While thankful, the guilt nevertheless overwhelmed him. He sank into a deep depression and nightmares of Frith toppling off the edge. Tom Rice and Bruce Weiner were hospitalized at UC Davis Medical Center, where both were in critical condition. Bruce spent 3 weeks or so at UC Davis and then was shipped home to Boston, where he stayed in the hospital in a burn unit. He had suffered major kidney damage and required a lot of skin grafts. Unfortunately for him, his grafts got infected and needed to be ripped off and replaced, a process Bruce says was worse than actually getting hit. Bruce lost over 70 pounds while he was bedridden. Unfortunately, most of that weight was muscle, which he had to gain all the way back so he could do fun things like walk correctly again. To this day, Bruce still has muscle loss from the experience. There is permanent nerve damage that he'll likely deal with for the rest of his life. He also has some lingering kidney problems. To this day, the lightning strike won't even let him pee normally. When Weiner reflects on what happened more than 30 years later, he is grateful. The people that took care of us rescued us and got us out of the cave and looked after us for all those hours until the helicopter came. They didn't know us. They just took it upon themselves to be there and never asked for anything. I'm always going to be very grateful. He also said it was reckless and irresponsible for the experienced leaders of the group, Rice and Esteban, to tell outdoor rookies like him and Frith that there was a safe haven on the summit in the event of a lightning storm. In reality, it was the least safe place we could have chosen to be at that moment, short of standing on top of that mountain with a big lightning rod in our hands, which is essentially what we were doing. But he also takes responsibility for his own ignorance and the dangerous situation it led him to, along with the self-imposed pressure and peer pressure to reach the summit. It was my responsibility to look out for myself and be smart. Ultimately, we made the decision and no one held a gun to our heads. Tom Rice was in the intensive care unit for weeks and had severe burns on his legs. He resented the fact that Esteban hadn't suffered any injuries and lambasted him for leaving. Esteban stormed out. Linda Crozier, the hiker who stepped in as the lead nurse on the summit, visited Rice many times during his hospital stay in Davis. He made a full recovery months later. The very next summer, Esteban, Rice, and Pippi returned to Half Dome summit. "We had to prove to ourselves we can do this," Rice stated. Adrian Esteban returned many times to Half Dome as it continued to serve as a barometer of his physical and mental well-being. The rock chamber, however, became a sacred place to not be disturbed, and stayed away from the enclosure during his ascents. On Wednesday, July 21st, 2010, the handful of parties hoping to summit the Grand Teton would all experience a mountain climber's worst nightmare. All awoke early and were camped above the timberline. Some were in a seasonal hut, others in tents. A few climbers, taking advantage of the clear night, had unrolled their sleeping bags between boulders and slept out under the stars. The day before, the forecast had been typical for the Tetons in summer, partly cloudy with a chance of thunderstorms by afternoon. But overnight, the likelihood of a storm had increased, so the commercial guides hustled their clients out of their sleeping bags at 3:30 a.m. At close to 4:30, 3 self-guided groups began pulling on their harnesses, helmets, and headlamps, and a half hour later they were making their way with coils of rope up through the talus and bands of cracked rock to the near vertical terrain below the summit. They were aware of clouds on the horizon, but determined to get to the top and back down before they closed in. They had less time than they imagined. Leading the first of the 3 groups were 2 brothers from Newton, Iowa, Greg and Barry Sparks, and their old friend from Bob Miller, all in their 50s. Their group was relatively large, 8 in all, and had the widest range of age and climbing experience. The 8 were relatives and church friends, such as Greg's son-in-law Tim Vogelaar, 43, a middle school art teacher. Over the years, some of them had been up Devil's Tower, Gannett Peak, and scores of Colorado's 14ers, mountains over 14,000 feet high. The Sparks group planned to climb via the Owen Spalding route, the oldest and easiest way up the Grand. This year, Barry Sparks had invited his daughter Katie's boyfriend, Brandon Oldenkamp. He and Katie weren't engaged, but it seemed to be moving in that direction, Barry said. I hoped this trip would be a chance for him and I to get to know each other better. His prospective son-in-law jumped at the offer. The Sparks group had the whole week to work with and began with climbs of the South and Middle Tetons. Everyone made it to the top of the South Teton with no problem, but the old guys decided to conserve their energy and leave the middle to the younger 4, who summited in brilliant sunshine on Tuesday. The second group, the Tyler Party, was a father and son's trip. There was Dad Stephen Tyler, his 2 sons Dan and Mike, their brother-in-law Troy Smith, and a work friend of Stephen's, Henry Appleton. Stephen, 67, had always been an outdoorsman, taking Dan and Mike backpacking from an early age. Stephen had first topped out on the Grand Teton in 1966. In 1983, when Dan and Mike were 13 and 12 respectively, they'd all tried it together. Bad weather kept them from the top at that time. Still, it wasn't as if the Tylers felt they had unfinished business. They just wanted to take advantage of the fact that they'd finally found a week in which they could all climb together. Stephen Tyler and Appleton, 31, were already there, both working in Grand Teton National Park. The Tyler Party also chose the Owen Spalding route. The third group, a couple and 2 friends from Bozeman, was led by Alan Klein, a 27-year-old climbing guide originally from Virginia. He had planned to go to Wyoming with only his friend Andrew Larson, 23, but at the last minute, Klein's girlfriend Betsy Smith, 26, and their friend Matt Walker, 21, rearranged their schedules and joined them. Klein and Smith had met in Yellowstone 3 years earlier and fallen in love over their shared love of the wilderness. The Bozeman group had climbed together too, but not in the Tetons. For their ascent, Klein settled on the Exum Ridge route. The Exum gets a little more sun than the Owen Spalding, but it's on a ridge, so there's nowhere to hide, and it's trickier to descend than other popular routes. After setting out that Wednesday morning, all 3 parties made good progress. By about 9 or so, the Bozeman group had made it to within 100 vertical feet of the summit. The Tyler Party had made it up through the Owen Chimney, considered the hardest challenge of the route, and the Sparks group, moving a little more slowly because of its size, had just cleared the belly roll, a detached, car-sized flake of rock bisecting a narrow ledge that requires one to climb up and over it, or out and around it. The handholds are solid, but climbers are exposed to a sheer drop of 800 to 1,000 feet. For someone new to climbing, it's terrifying to anticipate and enormously rewarding to overcome. When Oldenkamp made it past the belly roll, he flashed a wide, goofy smile that made him look as if he had just won a junior high league championship with a shot at the buzzer. Though the climbing was going well, the skies were darkening, and over the next half hour, just about everyone wondered if it was time to turn back, except for Klein, who determined that it would actually be faster and safer for his crew to summit and quickly descend by the Owen Spalding route than to backtrack. By 11:30 a.m., the Tyler party had turned around. Mike set up a rappel, an anchored rope to descend on, through the Owen chimney. He reached the bottom easily, and Dan had just started down the 80-foot chute when the first pulse of electricity coursed down over the wet rock. The Sparks group, 150 to 200 feet below the Tyler party, also felt it. I really don't know what you'd call it. It wasn't lightning like you've never seen lightning, Vogelaar said. It zinged down our rope. I felt it leave from my elbow, but I didn't see a flash. There was no boom that first time either. Other climbers near Vogelaar saw blue sparks and arcs around their shoes, and the jolt lifted Cameron Johnson, another member of the Sparks group from Worthington Mini, off the rock a few inches before setting him down, unscorched. For an instant, most of the Tyler party climbers were more amazed than panicked. But that's when we all agreed we should go down now, Vogelaar said. The Tyler party was mostly unaffected by that first bolt, except for Appleton. His right leg was numb. Dan Tyler, hearing Appleton cry out, "I can't feel my leg, I can't feel my leg," stopped rappelling down and started back up the rope to help. He wouldn't get there. Out on the Exum Ridge, things were even direr. Thunder sounded in the clouds that had engulfed them, and Klein told his 3 Bozeman group partners to toss into a pile as much of their metal as possible. Carabiners, cameras, pocket knives. Unfortunately, Smith forgot to remove her metal-plated wristwatch. From the clouds, there came a low, buzzing sound. Klein suggested that they step apart from each other, not that there was far for any of them to go. There were huge drops on both sides. Then they stood on their climbing ropes as insulation as their pile of gear vibrated, popped, and sparked. When we got struck, it was like slow motion, Betsy Smith said. I was watching Allen and Walker fall, and I was thinking they're falling, but not realizing I was falling too. Though the lightning probably struck within 50 yards of them, electricity buckled their legs, leaving Smith's and Walker's completely numb. They lay on the rock where they had been standing. The charge also entered Smith's and Klein's bodies. It was the most painful thing, Smith said. I've been through childbirth, and that was zero compared to this. It was like someone injected hot oil directly into my veins. I was screaming. When she came to a moment later, she could see the cuff on the sleeve of her parka smoking and smell burned hair and flesh. Her own. And then, for the moment, it was almost peaceful. Clouds rushing past, wind and rain hissing on the dense rock. The climbers were still in pain, but it was subsiding, and they looked at one another with anxious relief. Hey, maybe that was it? Then the low buzzing began to build again. Some fierce storms on the Grand Teton barely registered down in the valley, but not this one. This was not the afternoon shower that frequently arrives at altitude in the Rockies and blows out an hour later, leaving blue skies in its wake. This storm was monsoonal, and it featured cells that built along a pressure front like a line of freight cars. Worst of all, these cells regenerated themselves. Dan Tyler had made it only a few feet back up the rope when lightning struck again, so close that he was showered with small rocks kicked loose by the blast, followed immediately by a deafening boom. Dan, though, wasn't conscious to hear it. It knocked me into oblivion, he said of the lightning. When I came to, I was hanging upside down, and for a few seconds I wasn't sure where I was. I was completely disoriented. I then realized I was hanging on the rope. The next thing I noticed was that my legs were heavy. I couldn't feel them. His right arm was dead, too. I was unsure what to do and somewhat panicked, but I eventually realized I needed to get myself off that rope. So I fed some slack into the belaying device and was able to turn myself so my legs were below me. As Dan tried to navigate the narrow passage with a single arm, his legs were snagged against the wall and bent back unnaturally. It occurred to him that if he pressed too hard, he might break his own legs and not feel it. Maybe 5 minutes later, another lightning strike knocked some rocks loose above him. The rocks were small, but as they scattered down the chute, they added to a growing sense that the climbers were under siege. Above Mike and Dan, out of their sight, the charge had leveled Troy Smith, too. He fell, gashed his head, and stopped breathing. Steven Tyler had collapsed right next to him, and he saw Smith's eyes roll back, but he couldn't lift his own arms or move his legs. With an effort, he rolled Smith, who had fallen across his arm, and gave him mouth to mouth. After a half-dozen exhalations, Smith inhaled on his own, but he still wasn't all there. The ensuing 3 hours still do not exist in his memory. Mike couldn't see Dan, much less his dad, his brother-in-law, and Appleton. and he yelled to them over the noise of the storm, asking if they were okay. Dan and the party above yelled to each other, but neither could hear what the other said. Dan and Mike had better luck communicating and agreed that Mike should go for help. The only problem with that was that it left Dan alone and without any information about what had happened to his dad or the others. Like Mike and Dan Tyler, Greg Sparks had used the time since the first strike to lower himself and Brandon Oldenkamp down to a ledge, the very one that runs into the belly roll. Their group had decided that since Brandon was new to climbing, Greg should go down first and be there to see that Oldenkamp gained the ledge safely. Both did. Then the second bolt hit. Unlike the first one, it not only buckled their legs, but also packed a concussive punch. From 3 feet away, Greg watched helplessly as the force of the jolt propelled Oldenkamp off the ledge and over the side. To Greg's greater horror, the young man's rope did not catch and go taut. Instead, Greg could see the end of the rope on the wet stone. The rope, Greg swore, was slipped through Oldenkamp's harness loop and knotted at the end to prevent him from falling more than a few feet. Desperate, Greg craned over the cliff, but he knew it was hopeless. Below him, 800 feet down, lay the black ice couloir, a glaciated 50-degree ramp that drained over a series of cliffs into Valhalla Canyon. No surviving that. It just took him off, Greg said months later, still with a trace of disbelief. He swore Oldenkamp was tied into the rope, which would make the fall impossible, unless, that is, his harness failed, or the carabiner through which the rope passed had popped open, releasing the rope. Even then, the knot could have saved him. He couldn't have unclipped, Greg said. I'd have seen him. I was right there. He couldn't understand how it happened. He still can't. With the hand that worked best, Steven Tyler fished in his pack for his cell phone. He couldn't close his grip, and he had split his lip, so things got a little clumsy and bloody. Under different circumstances, he thought, it might have been slapstick. Eventually, he toggled to the most recent calls list and clicked on the last one he'd placed, which, he seemed to remember, had been to a ranger station for a weather update. He'd forgotten that Dan had since used the phone to check in with his wife, Heidi. So Steven's daughter-in-law, at a lodge with several of his grandchildren, picked up. He had 1 bar of wireless connectivity. No way could he risk dropping the call. As evenly as he could, he told her their situation. He did not volunteer details about Dan. He wouldn't have known what to say. Heidi's call was relayed to the Jenny Lake Rangers at 12:24 p.m. The Jenny Lake Rangers, or simply the Climbing Rangers, have evolved into one of the elite rescue teams in the world. In 1967, this elite force became renowned for a legendary rescue on the north face of the Grand Teton. 7 Rangers risked their lives to save a severely injured climber and his companion. The recovery took 3 harrowing days and pushed the team to new abilities. The legacy of this rescue was passed down throughout the years. A haven for dirtball climbers looking to get paid to hang out in the Tetons, the group has plenty of loners and mountain men, but it also has people who've done law enforcement training, a mix of type A's and poets that works. As physically fit as professional athletes, they exhibit the bonhomie of a championship ball club, rarely missing a chance to rib one another. In all, there are 4 full-timers and 14 seasonal rangers. Among them, the Climbing Rangers have amassed 230 years of experience in the Tetons. Soon after Steven's SOS, more calls came in, and the Rangers didn't know if they were members of the same party or from different parties. In the office of the rescue cache, their headquarters at the base of Tiwanaut Mountain, northeast of the Grand Teton, the Climbing Rangers tried to make sense of what they were hearing, as there were many people on the mountain needing rescue. Ranger Jack McConnell remembers with head-shaking astonishment, "That's a bus wreck on a mountain." By the time the Rangers had a better grip on how many people they were looking for, a few of them, including McConnell and Helen Bowers, were already airborne in a chopper flown by a 30-year-old ace named Matt Hart. Though he'd been the head of the Climbing Rangers only 1 month, 34-year-old Scott Gunther had made the bold decision to launch a search and rescue operation. Even though rain had begun to fall in the valley, thunder rumbled not from far. The cache and the Grand Teton itself had vanished under a low ceiling of dark clouds. Hart flew a yellow A-Star B-3 with the doors off. That high on the Grand, there was no place for a helicopter to land, so the Rangers would have to pull people off using a procedure called the short haul. First introduced in the Tetons in 1986, short hauling involves attaching a cable to a helicopter with either a litter or a so-called screamer suit, which isn't a suit really, but a full-body harness that works well for anyone who hasn't suffered spinal injuries. The injured party has his or her arms and legs put through sewn holes and is then clipped into the cable and whisked away. It's like a jacket diaper configuration, McConnell explains, but it's the best ride in the Tetons, a tilt-a-whirl on steroids. A number of the climbing rangers had done short hauls before. Once, in 2005, the rangers had short-hauled 13 climbers, also lightning struck from just below the Exum Ridge. The 2005 rescue had been another long day, but that storm had swiftly blown out. The rangers simply raced against nightfall, when it's no longer safe to fly the chopper. This time was different. Hart and the rangers were going into the teeth of the storm. Hart's first destination was the lower saddle, one of the two main base camps for those climbing the Grand. Exum Mountain Guides, one of two commercial services with permits to guide the Grand, maintains a hut there from June to September. The service volunteered the hut as a base camp for the operation. As soon as they touched down on the lower saddle, McConnell and Bowers recruited Exum guide Dan Korn to go up the mountain with them. A sunny, highly accomplished alpinist who climbs and guides year-round, Korn, 27, had been among those who'd left for the summit at 3:30 a.m., and with two fit clients, been to the top and returned to the lower saddle base camp before the lightning strikes. McConnell was glad to have Korn on the search party so he could give the younger man the heaviest gear and medical kits. Within a half hour, before reaching the steepest rock faces, McConnell, Bowers, and Korn encountered Mike Tyler and a couple of members of the Sparks party on their way down. Mike had lost his gloves, so Korn gave him his. Bowers stayed with the climbers. McConnell and Korn continued on up. Luckily, they came within view of three other members of the Sparks group, including Vogelar, just in time. The shell-shocked trio was about to make a common but life-threatening mistake and head toward the so-called Idaho Express, a cliff that drops several thousand feet off the Grand's west face. "Don't go down that way, it's a death trap," Korn yelled into the wind. Hearing them, Vogelar and the others stopped and made their way to the black rock chimneys, the right way down. The storm had let up a bit, and Hart made a quick pass around the base of the summit pyramid. He soon had a bead on all the stricken climbers, but it would still be an hour or more before the rangers could reach them and begin the short hauls. In the meantime, a second helicopter brought more rangers to the lower saddle. They too started up. McConnell and Korn met up with the last of the Sparks group and helped them down to the hut on their own steam, and then returned to climbing in earnest. It was difficult, with water gushing down the rock and pouring from chutes in flash waterfalls. The faces they saw as they poked up out of the Owen chimney still haunt Korn. All the climbers could answer him on topic, but they were not all there. They looked like zombies. Steven Tyler and Troy Smith were especially ghoulish, bluish with cold. Blood streaked down their faces. A slush of snow and small hailstones lined the seams of their parkas. Steven told Korn he thought he'd gone hypothermic. They had a winter layer on, but they'd been in the storm for more than 3 hours without being able to move. In the mountains especially, motion is heat, and heat is life. Larson, from the Klein group, had been trying to find help, and had reached rangers who had gathered the lightning victims and huddled with them under a slight overhang to await the helicopter. The storm had picked up force again, and they all ditched their metal. McConnell had begun to pull a tarp over one side of the overhang for a bit of extra shelter when electricity snapped at his elbow. More lightning. The morale of the group, which had greatly improved when the helicopter passed over and the rangers arrived, sank. The rangers were running out of time if they were to get everyone off by dark, and the urgency grew now with the intensifying storm. Hart banked the helicopter in toward the rock and dropped the cable. The screamer suit slid down the cable. McConnell detached it and tried to throw it to another ranger, but it fell short. They scrambled for a minute while Hart tried to hold his position in the A-Star, the wind and rain whipping in his face as he flew. His co-pilot kept an eye on the tail rotor to make sure it didn't swing into the rock. That would be deadly. A stripped-down version of the A-Star had made it all the way to the summit of Everest on a 2005 stunt flight, so the aircraft had no problem with the thin air. But holding a chopper steady in those conditions takes a rare, Zen-like skill. Finally, the Rangers got the harness set between Troy Smith's legs and under his arms and hooked him to the cable with two big carabiners. The Rangers took a step back and waved to Hart, and the chopper whisked Smith right off the rock and out into the void. Still not comprehending that he'd been struck by lightning, Smith found the ride, as McConnell promised, awesome. He didn't scream, he gave a hoarse whoop of joy. Over the next 2 hours, all of the climbers but Dan Tyler were evacuated at least as far down as the lower saddle, where the second helicopter had begun ferrying injured climbers to the valley. For the climbing rangers in the cache, the operation had become a logistical drama as they coordinated 70-plus people in what had become the most complex rescue in the park's 82-year history, and it wasn't over. The Ranger weatherman advised pulling the chopper out to see what the next storm cell had in store before attempting another short haul. It was like an F-16 ripping open the sky, McConnell said of that squall. It was decided that he'd head down while Rangers Drew Hardesty and Marty Vidak stayed with Dan. Some feeling had returned to Dan's arms and legs, and he could wiggle his toes a little, but he was terribly cold. McConnell told them he really hated to be going so soon. Dan appreciated the humor, but he really wanted off that mountain. He couldn't face the prospect of being out overnight, and it was starting to get dim. For Dan, the helicopter hadn't just represented hope, it was hope, and now it was leaving. His despair didn't last long. Within the hour, Hart had taken advantage of another short window in the storm to return and pluck Dan off. Dan did not enjoy the short-haul ride nearly as much as his brother-in-law had. Out in the vast space over all that rock and snow of the Tetons, he had trouble breathing. He shivered and closed his eyes until it was over. It was just too much. Dan only spent 15 minutes in the base camp hut, just long enough to be stuffed into a sleeping bag and given a cup of hot chocolate flown down to the valley. He still couldn't walk, but he was feeling like he would eventually. Once in the valley, the EMTs ran an IV into him and had him wait in an ambulance. It's a 30-minute drive to the hospital, so the Rangers had to take more than one at a time. A few minutes passed, they opened up the back of the ambulance, and his dad entered. The old man was roughed up, split lip, dried blood on his nose, some loss of hearing, but he'd made it. Dan broke down. He had never been happier to see his dad in his life. The following morning, Hart started up the A-Star again for the grim trip out to Valhalla Canyon to recover Brandon Oldenkamp's body. Like all the climbing rangers, Hart knew well that adventures in the mountains could carry fateful consequences. The park averages 1 to 3 deaths per year, statistically not bad perhaps given the 4 million visitors. But Hart found Oldenkamp's death profoundly sad. At least he and the other rangers had been able to save the lives of a handful more. Hypothermia and other injuries could have proved fatal to several of the lightning victims had there not been a helicopter to get them down fast. Several of the climbers were back at their lodge rooms by 9 or 10 that night, but a few had more serious medical issues. Troy Smith turned out to be okay, but would be loopy for weeks. Betsy Smith lost the index finger on her right hand, where the charge had exited her body, killing all the tissue. The finger had to be amputated and stitched up. Her wristwatch had burned her left arm severely. The arm was so swollen that surgeons had to cut it to keep blood flowing into her left hand. Only Alan Klein ended up in the ICU. He had burns across his back and probably should have died. The electricity that had coursed through him had torn his lungs slightly, allowing air to seep into his chest and put pressure on his heart, which was beating at only 35 beats per minute when he was admitted to the hospital. The doctor who saw me told me I had more air in my chest than anyone he'd ever seen who wasn't dead, Klein says. 1 year later, Steven Tyler still can't hear as well, though he's not sure if that's all from the lightning or from turning 68. Most of the rest have made a full recovery, at least physically. Several have continued climbing. For Klein, it's his livelihood. Others have forsworn it, or plan to do less ambitious hikes, all under blue skies, thank you very much. Asked if he'd attempt the Grand again, Mike Tyler says, "No, I think we got the message." The ranger who coordinated the rescue from headquarters, Jim Springer, investigated why Oldenkamp's rope and harness hadn't broken his fall. It appeared Oldenkamp might have passed the rope through a weaker loop on his harness, one not designed to take his weight. Or maybe the rope slipped out of the carabiner on his harness, which had been found unlocked. Or maybe, reaching the ledge, Oldenkamp had simply unclipped from the rope. Oldenkamp was devoted to God, and his family says his faith, and theirs, has helped them earn a measure of peace. "I still weep sometimes," his father, Bob Oldenkamp, says. "We weren't ready for him to go. But I do know that in those mountains, Brandon saw the best the Creator has ever made. And in a heartbeat, he got to see him who made it." For one group of hikers, their Zion slot canyoneering adventure would be a tragedy. Zion National Park, with its towering Navajo sandstone walls and plunging network of gorges carved by the Virgin River, is the American ground zero for canyoneering, and Keyhole is considered an ideal introduction. 5 minutes off the park's Zion Mount Carmel Highway, the slot canyon is only 1,200 feet long and requires just 3 30-foot rappels and a bit of scrambling and swimming through the cold pools that collect year-round beneath its smooth, narrow walls. We like to say that canyoneering isn't an extreme sport unless you're not very smart about it. In a way, it's more dangerous than rock climbing because once you start into a canyon, you're committed to coming out the bottom. Whereas in rock climbing, you have to have some competency to get up high enough to get into trouble, says Tom Jones, a former Zion Adventure Company guide. Canyoneering's complicated rope work, chilly swims, and infrequent glimpses of the sky actually make it more similar to spelunking. Canyoneers don wetsuits and harnesses and sometimes even headlamps as they hike, rappel, and swim their way through tight spaces. The group of 7 hikers, 6 from California, had been planning their descent into the canyon for months. Gary Favela, Don Teichner, Muku Reynolds, Steve Arthur, Linda Arthur, Robin Brum, and Mark McKenzie had extensive hiking experience. All but one took a 5-hour canyoneering class offered by the local Zion Adventure Company on Monday morning of September 15, 2015. While 3 men and 3 women started the class, Mark McKenzie, the one with canyoneering experience, went down the road to the Park Visitors Center and bought a $15 permit to descend into Keyhole that day. All of them were in their 50s, and many had met through the Valencia Hiking Crew, a meetup.com group that organizes outings ranging from strolls through downtown Los Angeles to long hikes in Joshua Tree National Park. "We are not a beginner hiking group. A small amount of danger or risk, while still being safe, can also add to a hike's enjoyment," Don Teichner, one of the club's founders, said. After completing their rappelling course, the 6 friends rejoined Mackenzie. They were well aware of the potential for flash floods. Just after noon, Teichner called his wife from the Watchman campground where the group was staying. The campground sits just at the edge of cell service within the park. At 11:52 a.m., Mackenzie texted his son from Watchman. "Eating lunch, this is my view. Maybe Keyhole this afternoon." He attached a photo that showed with seemingly innocuous cumulus clouds wisping by. That March, Mackenzie had spent a week canyoneering in Zion with his other son, Ryan, completing Keyhole and a handful of additional slots, including Heaps, one of the park's longest and most difficult descents. At 1:30 p.m., the 7 packed their gear into Teichner's and the Arthur's pickup trucks and drove 9 miles to the parking pullout for Keyhole. From the road, the sky is visible to the south and west, but the horizon is obscured by walls of white sandstone. What they could see probably represented the next half hour's worth of weather. What they couldn't see was the towering anvil cloud that was just passing from southwest to northeast. At about 2 p.m., they drove into the park toward the canyon and lost their cell phone coverage, snacked in the parking lot, then headed up the slick rock sandstone, about a 5-minute walk to the drop-in point for Keyhole. The upper portion of Keyhole Canyon is relatively flat, with only a couple hundred feet of light scrambling, and is where the 7 posed for a photo. Teichner, who moved from Southern California to Nevada in the spring, stood in the foreground, his right foot straddling a boulder. Steve and Linda Arthur, grandparents of 7, wrapped arms with Robin Brum, a hairstylist from their hometown, Camarillo. Muku Reynolds, who often looked for heart-shaped rocks on her hikes, peeked from behind. Gary Favela, an experienced camper, hiker, and skier from Rancho Cucamonga, leaned in on the left. Mark McKenzie, saddled with a bright red pack, framed them on the right. It was a picture of ease, of warmth and unpretentiousness, as they prepared to go deeper into the canyon. Less than an hour after the California group received a permit to Keyhole, the Weather Service raised the chance of rain to 50%. At the Zion Visitor Center, A ranger wrote on a cardboard sign near the wilderness desk that flash flooding that day was probable. Rangers also informed people verbally when they sought permits later in the day. 20 minutes later, the Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for southeast Zion, the area that includes Keyhole. Move to higher ground now. Act quickly to protect your life, the service forecasters wrote with their typical uppercase intensity. At this point, the warning would be too late for the Canyoneers in Keyhole to receive it. Soon afterward, the slot opens up again, the last place where a party could decide to bail out, before the first rappel takes Canyoneers down into the dark, narrow slot itself. The group proceeded down the first rappel and were enjoying their adventure so far. There was a lot of laughing and cheering, and they were having a great time, Jim Clary, another Canyoneering in Keyhole that day. Favela and Mackenzie were still at the top when Clearly arrived at the first rappel. They saw us coming up and they said hello, seemed pretty friendly. Honestly, I didn't want to be behind a group that big in that canyon on a day like that, and it's kind of common courtesy in Zion to let smaller, quicker groups pass. So I asked, do you mind if we play through? Mackenzie told him that would be fine. At that point, they all could have still exited the canyon, but there was no sign of danger. They could see a sliver of sky, and it was blue. Before Clary's group moved past, most of the Valencia group had completed the first rappel. Favela was next, but he'd inadvertently set up his rope for a left-handed descent. Mackenzie helped him fix it. Clary noticed that the Valencia group was using a technique called toss and go, the basic rappel in which the entire rope is looped through a carabiner, allowing people to descend on the doubled strand. It's simple and safe, but slower than the single-strand binder block method Clary's party was using, since it requires the entire bag of rope to be unfurled and repacked at each rappel. Clary slid down the rope in a smooth motion and unclipped. He ran ahead and set up his rope at the second rappel and then ran back to see Favela descending. While the Valencia group repacked their rope, Clary's party went ahead. That was the last contact the two groups had. 20 minutes later, the storm reached Zion. Deep in Keyhole, the Canyoneers still had no idea that a flash flood warning had been issued. At the third rappel, everything changed. A clear, close thunderclap peeled down the canyon walls. I got my brother-in-law Rob off the rope and I told him, "Just go," Jim Clary said. Rob took off downstream, swimming through a 6-foot-deep, shoulder-width hallway. They knew once we got through the 3 rappels, we had 5 minutes of canyon and we're out. Once I heard that thunder, I stopped looking up because I knew I was going to go as fast as we could, Clary said. Clary understood that the 7 people above his group might save a few minutes if he left his rope up for them, but he'd used the single-strand binder block technique, and he remembered that the Valencia group was using a double strand. I was afraid that it would confuse them and maybe slow them down, so I pulled my rope and started moving down canyon, Clary said. Clary's brother and brother-in-law had stopped at a 6-foot down climb because it had gotten too dark to see. About halfway between the third rappel and the exit, it began to rain. There was no front edge to the storm. It switched on like a fire hose. It came down hard. Rain, hail. That's as fast as I've ever seen it change, with as little warning as I've ever seen, Jim said. Waterfalls of runoff began pouring in. They had 50 yards to go. Gradually, the walls of the canyon backed off enough that they could climb up and out of the stagnant pools, which were stirring to life and beginning to flow. It had been raining for 5 minutes. By the time Clary and his brother-in-law reached the road, the water was at least waist deep, racing through the 10-foot-wide culvert that carried it under the road and into Clear Creek, a flow of several hundred cubic feet per second. There's this adrenaline rush coming through that we just made it, Jim said. At that point, they realized there was no way the group above them could have escaped. The men climbed into their truck and drove to the nearest ranger kiosk, a mile to the west at the entrance to the Zion Mount Carmel tunnel. The ranger on duty tried the radio to relay their report, but the frequency was jammed with traffic. The roads were covered in mud, and small landslides were coming down from the mountains. They continued on toward Springdale and encountered a second ranger at a series of steep switchbacks just after the tunnel, and informed him of the event unfolding at Keyhole, but the ranger didn't seem really interested in talking with Clary and ushered him through. From the Park Service's point of view, all hell had just broken loose. Flooding, mudslides, rock falls, trees coming down. On that day in September, the park would have had more than 10,000 visitors, with a monsoonal storm, engulfing a packed Zion National Park. 20 minutes later, the storm let up, and blue skies above again, and a search for the Valencia Canyoneering group commenced. One day later, Caden Anderson, a 25-year-old off-duty canyoneering guide, was leading two friends, India and Jay Piazzatelli. The couple had gotten married 2 days earlier, overlooking the Grand Canyon's Horseshoe Bend, and they decided to honeymoon their way home through Utah's national parks. The Anderson group was in the canyon illegally as the Park Service closed permitting into Keyhole following the incident. The rescuers hadn't checked Keyhole for the missing canyoneers because water levels were still too high. As the trio came to a rappel ledge peering over the edge, they could make out something submerged in the small pool below. "When we saw the leg sticking out, we didn't know what it was and joked about it," India said. Caden decides to descend to take a closer look. The rope descended 30 feet, terminating in a mess in the muddy pool. A shoe was tangled up in the line. Anderson grabbed it, only to find that it was attached to a person floating in the murky water. Checking for life, he flipped the body over and saw a middle-aged male whose skin was cold and white. "It was obvious that he was dead," says Anderson. "I yelled back up at my friends, 'There's a body down here.'" Earlier in the day, rescuers found Steve Arthur's body, roughly a mile downstream in Clear Creek. As the creek bed returned to its normal dry state, more victims turned up in the area and beyond. And by the late evening 2 days later, the bodies of all 7 of the lost canyoneers would be found. Don Teichner, the group's leader, a 55-year-old who was semi-retired from managing his family's garment dyeing facility in Los Angeles, 59-year-old Muku Reynolds, a special education aide from Chino, 53-year-old Robin Brum, a hairstylist from Camarillo, Mark McKenzie, 56, a system operator for Burbank Water and Power, and Gary Favela, the man Anderson and the Piazzatellis discovered, a 51-year-old sales rep from Rancho Cucamonga. The final victim, Steve Arthur's wife, Linda, had traveled the farthest, 5 miles downstream, through the Clear Creek drainage into Pine Creek Canyon. All were found in separate places downstream. No one was left to tell the story of what exactly happened. The same storm also stunned an isolated Mormon fundamentalist community about 20 miles to the south. 3 adults and 9 children were killed when floodwaters rushed out of a canyon outside Hilldale. Another child is still missing. The Keyhole disaster left the park's rangers badly shaken. It left the families of the dead wondering whether their loved ones had somehow been reckless or misinformed. And it left veteran canyoneers speculating about just how this kind of thing could have happened. The most innocuous slot in Zion had produced the worst canyoneering disaster in American history, and the worst accident of any kind in Zion's 97 years. Many questioned why beginners would be allowed in the canyon on their own. Zion doesn't allow any technical guidance inside its boundaries. The reason, as with many park regulations, primarily comes down to tradition. No guides were working these canyons in 1919 when Zion was officially protected, so there was no lobby to argue for a concession. In 2007, when the park updated its wilderness management plan, the rangers determined that even though demand for guides existed, there were 3.6 million visitors in 2015, with roughly 60,000 of those obtaining backcountry permits. The park had more than enough traffic without them. In a public opinion poll, 82% of respondents voted against commercial guiding. At Zion, there are very few places where rangers will tell you not to do something for your own safety. If you want to climb the giant sandstone walls or descend the steep canyons, it's up to you to learn the skills and look out for yourself. People make their own decisions about risk and accept the consequences, which can be swift and severe. It was one of the deadliest days of weather in Utah's history. Allison Botcher, Steve and Linda Arthur's daughter, said, "This wasn't a reckless group. These were parents and grandparents and people who had loved ones at home. They cared about the wilderness and they know how powerful it can be. There's no way they would have gone in there if they had any thought in their mind it could be dangerous. There's just no way. They wouldn't have done it." Her brother Bobby Arthur said, "I think the hardest part for my family was that they found my dad first and my mom last. That was just brutal." The Arthurs had been married for 37 years. They'd met right out of high school at the Topanga Mall. "Mom worked at Orange Julius and Dad worked at Florsheim," says Allison. Both Bobby and Allison are convinced that, when the flood hit, their father would have told their mother to go as fast as she could and then stay behind to help. "My dad, being the person that he is, I'm sure he told everybody to get out," says Allison. "He would stay with Gary, help him down the last rappel." For Mike Helms, Bob Candico, Simon McCartney, and Jack Roberts, their ascent of Denali would be a memorable story of survival and heroism. The story begins in late May 1980, just days after the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Talkeetna is ground zero for American alpinism, and Bob Candico was a part of that scene. After 2 years of graduate school, Bob is living in a VW camper van full of dirtbag gear and climbing magazines. A recent convert to climbing, he had 2 summer seasons under his belt with ascents in the Canadian Rockies, Selkirks, and St. Elias ranges, and was hungry for the bigger stage. The best opportunity was to talk his way onto a team that was ascending Denali. He was able to, but had to wait for good weather. A few days later, early in the morning, the clouds thinned, revealing the rose-tinted hue of sunrise, striking the summit of the highest peak in North America, meaning flights to the glacier base camp on Denali would commence today. Bob and his new team of climbers were off to conquer the Great Denali. The flight into the Alaska range from Talkeetna offered views that transitioned quickly from treeless bogs to jagged granite peaks rising out of rivers of ice. I almost fell onto my knees in awe as I gawked at the dozen peaks that soared a vertical mile out of the ice. Each single peak was more magnificent and daunting than any I had previously seen. We had a month to climb them all. This would be nirvana. But nirvana had to wait, as one low-pressure system after another hurled clouds laden with wet snow against the peaks. Elation turned to gloom. Endless card games were played to alleviate the boredom of tent life in inclement weather. After 12 days spent mostly in damp, clammy sleeping bags, Bob's new climbing partners announced they were giving up and heading back. Bob was devastated. With no reason to head home, and in truth, no home to head to, I resorted to visiting other tents on the glacier, in hopes of finding a new climbing partner, Bob says. As luck would have it, the first tent Bob visited held Mike Helms, an outdoor gear designer and guide from Olympia. His 2 friends had also decided to fly out early. After a brief introduction, climbing skills and history were shared, Bob would team up with Mike for an attempt at the highest peak in North America. From their new camp, the route would deviate from the normal climber's route, which ascended the less technical West Buttress. They would take the Cassin Ridge, considered one of the premier technical climbs in North America. Their strategy was to move in one push, carrying everything for the climb, up 8,000 feet of steep ice and granite rock cliffs, and then descend via the standard West Buttress route. This alpine-style ascent of the Cassin Ridge had only been attempted a few times before 1980. As average journeyman climbers, they were setting their goals to the highest standard. To attempt such a route with a total stranger might seem like a reckless decision, but to Mike and Bob, it was simply a challenge not to be missed. And off are Mike and Bob, climbing one of the most majestic mountains in the world. On their ascent, they ran into 2 other climbers who had even loftier ambitions. They decided to camp together for the night. Jack Roberts and Simon McCartney were attempting to ascend the unclimbed mile-high wall on the southwest face. With climbing resumes that included the north face of the Eiger in winter, ascents of El Capitan walls in Yosemite, and first ascents of audacious and dangerous faces in the Alps and the Alaska range, they were the climbers that they aspired to be. They were the elite. Their cockiness and charisma were infectious. Mike and Bob were truly awed to be in the company of some of the top climbers in the world. 3 days later, with clearing weather, the 4 of them left the glacier campsite at 12,000 feet. Bob takes a moment to turn and sees Jack and Simon's footsteps leading to the base of their daunting objective. For 8 days, Bob and Mike traversed up the Cassin Ridge. More severe than they anticipated, the route challenged the 2 in every aspect with its steep ice and vertical steps up the granite cliffs. After an exhausting day of 12 hours of climbing, they were fortunate to find a narrow ledge on which to erect their tent. Before succumbing to much-needed sleep, Bob and Mike silently struggled with the doubt. But there was no retreat in their plan. Bob lay awake, quivering with fear as gusts of wind thrashed the single layer of fabric comprising their shelter. Their ascent rate slowed considerably as Bob struggled to adjust to the altitude. His brain, starved for oxygen, was functioning on a several-second delay mode. They decided to take an unscheduled rest day to allow time for Bob to acclimatize. The following day, they made a miraculous discovery of 2 gallons of cooking gas, stashed from an earlier expedition, a welcome replenishment of their dwindling supply. None of these circumstances were unusual for alpinists on difficult routes. Both Mike and Bob had read inspirational accounts of such climbs, but struggling in the reality of such tenuous circumstances was vastly different than reading articles in glossy magazines. Meanwhile, the climb was going well for Simon McCartney and Jack Roberts. The ascent consisted of rock and mixed climbing at a high technical standard for several days. Some days, the duo erected a small bivouac tent. Other nights were spent sitting out in the open. But by day 8, at around 17,000 feet, Simon's condition became worrying. He became uncoordinated and was slurring his words. On day 9, they made the junction at the Cassin Ridge route at 18,000 feet. They kept climbing through the night, hoping to reach the summit of the mountain. But McCartney's condition was continually worsening as they gained altitude. Somewhere above 19,000 feet, they were forced to stop. Roberts managed to cut out a ledge in the ice for their bivy tent, but by then, they were out of food. They still had some fuel left for their stove to melt snow. They had to descend first thing in the morning, but the following day, their 10th, the weather was too bad to move. On day 11, the weather was bad again, and Roberts had to keep digging their tent out, whereas Simon was by then completely helpless, suffering from edema. In 1980, not as much was known about acclimatization, and being high for so long in such a condition could mean death. On day 12, the weather finally improved, but they had no way of signaling for a rescue, and in any case, they were too high for a helicopter lift-off. Roberts began to realize his feet were frostbitten and decided their only hope of rescue was for him to climb solo over the summit and down the west flank and hope for a meeting with a climbing party. He realized Simon's chances of survival were small, so he made him list his immediate family and friends to contact and for him to say his goodbyes. He was prepared to leave, but stopped outside the tent, unable to take the first step and leave his stricken comrade. With calm winds and an azure blue sky overhead, Mike Helms and Bob Candico departed their campsite on a tiny platform chiseled on the ridge crest at 18,000 feet, taking their first steps towards the summit, just 2,000 feet above them. The negative 40-degree cold was piercing, but the sun offered an illusion of warmth. The view stretched out over the surrounding peaks to the distant Gulf of Alaska. Their ascent was even more labored at this point, step after grueling step. Bob's altimeter watch recorded an elevation of 19,000 feet. Step, inhale, Bob whispers to himself. Suddenly they hear a voice. They looked upslope and were amazed to see a lone figure jumping and shouting beside a tent. It took them a painfully long 30 minutes of kicking steps to finally reach Jack Roberts, and to learn that his climbing partner Simon was semi-conscious in the tent, disabled by cerebral edema. This swelling of the tissues of the brain is caused by a rapid ascent in altitude and is worsened by dehydration. They had been successful in completing their very difficult climb, but had run out of fuel and subsequently had no way to melt snow for much-needed water. Jack's toes were black with frostbite, and they had not eaten in days. The 4 of them were 800 vertical feet below the summit on the remote south face, with no radio and only 2 meager freeze-dried dinners between them. What took place in the next 20 minutes changed the lives of the 4 men. A decision had to be made. One climber was disabled, one had frostbite, and the other 2 were weakened by their arduous ascent. Bob and Mike's mental cognition was less than ideal as a result of the altitude and exhaustion, but in those 20 minutes they worked out what seemed to be our best option. Mike had been on the West Buttress route previously, so he had knowledge of the way down. There would certainly be other climbers on that route. Jack had knowledge of technical rescue systems, but his frostbite was severe. Jack proposed that Mike and he would ascend over the top, descend until they encountered other climbers, retrace their steps to the ridge above to lower ropes to Bob and Simon, and pull them over the top. Mike did not want to split away from Bob, but Bob volunteered to stay with Simon. He moves into the tent with Simon, took all the fuel and meager scraps of food, gave Jack a short note to Bob's mother, and then watched them kick-step upward. The 2 days that Simon and Bob waited on Cassin Ridge were agonizing as the reality of their situation sunk in. They were completely isolated on the steepest and most remote face of the highest peak in North America. Simon was incapacitated. They were out of rations. After realizing that our only chance of survival was to make an attempt to evacuate themselves, Bob and Simon suited up to attempt the final ascent to the summit ridge. Bob carried most of the weight, but Simon simply dropped to his knees, unable to stand upright due to his cerebral edema. Bob jerked tight on the rope, attempting to haul him uphill, but he collapsed, in tears. The thought of untying the rope and heading up alone crossed Bob's mind, but he could not leave Simon to die. Their only choice was unthinkable: to descend the length of Cassin Ridge without food, and with no gear except a single rope. Meanwhile, Mike Helms and Jack Roberts continued up to within a short distance of the summit, and then started down the West Buttress route. But they would have more bad weather, along with difficulty getting reception, once they met another climbing party with a radio. In addition, another climber in distress had to be rescued, and Helms and Roberts stepped in to assist. They were far from getting back to assist Bob and Simon. That descent for Bob Candico and Simon McCartney started with Simon sliding on the snow as Bob tethered him with the rope. Grueling days of plunge stepping, rappelling, and at times crawling downward. On the third day, they heard the unmistakable sound of an airplane overhead and saw a plane through the clouds. With renewed optimism, Bob stamped out the word "help" in 6-foot-long letters in the snow and positioned the climbing rope in an X's to mark a possible landing spot for a rescue helicopter. This location was one of the few sites on the ridge where a helicopter might be able to land, so Bob did not want to descend further. In clear skies and calm winds, they waited. Minutes turned into hours, longing to hear the throb of an approaching helicopter. As evening approached, their enthusiasm evaporated. They set up their tent and crawled into their cold bags, and without words spoken, accepted that their ordeal was not to end with a quick exit. Tonight would be another, without food. In the morning, Bob and Simon continued down the steepest section of the Cassin Ridge. The lack of food and extreme exertion had caused their urine to become a rust-orange color. At one point, they discovered used tea bags in the snow at the site of an old campsite and consumed them. They even resorted to toothpaste soup, but they never lost hope. Then they found 2 coils of climbing ropes cached on a ledge, enabling them to rappel down places they could not down-climb. Still, they grew weaker and weaker. Then, when they were totally spent and had not more to give, 4 climbers from Pennsylvania appeared and came to their aid. The Pennsylvanians shared their food and tent and assisted them down the lower technical section, thereby sacrificing their own summit opportunity. As they reached the main glacier, Simon and Bob, barely able to walk by now, slipped and tumbled over an unseen ice cliff. Simon fell 50 feet, plunging into a crevasse, breaking his wrist and giving him a concussion. Instead of walking down the remainder of the glacier, he was loaded into a rescue toboggan for an all-night sledding to an airstrip. After more delays because of poor weather, McCartney was finally taken by helicopter to Anchorage. By this time, he had more medical issues on top of the edema. A broken wrist and concussion suffered the fall into the crevasse. Sadly, just before Bob was rescued off the mountain, he talked with 4 climbers who had just arrived and were excited to head up the Cassin Ridge. He learned later that summer that they were never seen again, probably victims of an avalanche. At about the same time, Mike Helms and Jack Roberts reached a place where Roberts could be airlifted to an Anchorage hospital to receive treatment for his frostbitten feet. Mike was desperate to learn the fates of Bob Candico and Simon McCartney, but he found out from search and rescue that they were rescued and were on their way to the hospital. "Once I found out they were down, I caught the next flight to Talkeetna," Mike said. "I was drained physically, mentally, and emotionally. I was done." More than 3 decades later, Mike would recall that when he looked back at Bob and Simon, he thought that he would never see them again. What happened on Denali back in 1980 had profound and lasting effects on the 4 men, albeit in different ways. Simon McCartney needed about a year to recover from his injuries, and by then he had decided to give up climbing. I had no desire to go back in the mountains and climb things that were easier than my capabilities, he said. I also came to realize that I'd probably be killed if I attempted to do something harder than Denali. The prospects for survival weren't good, so I quit. It was very, very hard to do. It left a big hole in my life, he stated. McCartney was an accomplished climber in Europe and North America and was walking away. He expressed the gratitude he feels for Mike Helms and Bob Candico. It is very hard to verbalize. How do I feel about Mike and Bob? It's indescribable. I mean, those guys put themselves in harm's way that I might have a chance to survive. After returning from Alaska in 1980, Bob Candico continued to have a very active climbing career and still loves climbing. As for Helms, he continued climbing for a few years after Denali, and then he also gave up climbing. For most of the next 35 years, this story of selfless valor remained largely untold. Fortunately, there is no statute of limitations for acts of mountaineering heroism. Simon McCartney, who escaped death on Denali in 1980 thanks to the rescue efforts of Mike Helms and Bob Candico, has written a book about that climb and others he made with his late climbing friend Jack Roberts, who died in a 2012 Colorado climbing accident. So in January 2016, the American Alpine Club honored Mike Helms and Bob Candico with its prestigious David Sowles Memorial Award. According to a club statement, the honor is given to mountaineers who have distinguished themselves by going to the assistance of fellow climbers imperiled in the mountains. What Helms and Candico did on Denali was an epic rescue and one of the great stories of Alaska climbing history, American Alpine Club executive editor Dougal MacDonald said. It is, he added, high time they get more recognition for their brave efforts. For Helms, who was 66 at the time of the award ceremony, the award brought a secondary, but no less meaningful, benefit. In the years since that fateful climb, during which the four men had virtually no contact with each other, he continued to think he should have done something different, something more. Though no lives were lost, the memory of what happened on Denali was always, for Helms, tainted with regret. But when Mike Helms, Bob Candico, Jack's widow Pam Roberts, and Simon McCartney reunited for the ceremony, the three surviving climbers and Jack's wife have been able to reconnect, communicate, and bring closure to what was a watershed event in their lives. Amidst the enchanting allure of United States national parks lies a profound reminder of nature's unforgiving power. These majestic landscapes, while captivating and breathtaking, can quickly transform into arenas of challenge and risk. The very essence of danger pulses within the heart of these untamed regions. Rugged terrains and untrodden paths beckon adventurers, yet they also demand respect and caution. The danger that resides here is not a deterrent, but rather a testament to the untamed spirit of the wild. It's a reminder that within the embrace of these parks, one must tread with respect, for the forces of nature can be relentless and unforgiving. In the shadow of the towering peaks of Yosemite and the depths of yawning canyons of Zion, danger serves as a humbling force, reminding us of our vulnerability and igniting a primal respect for the natural world. It teaches us to be prepared, to honor our limitations, and to navigate the delicate balance between exploration and preservation. While danger may cast its shadow, it does not overshadow the profound beauty and transformative experiences that these parks offer. Instead, it adds a layer of authenticity and significance to our encounters with the wilderness. It fosters resilience, ignites a sense of responsibility, and encourages a deep connection to nature. So, as we stand at the precipice of adventure within our national parks, let us not shy away from the risks that lie ahead. Let us embrace them with open hearts and minds, understanding that within these challenges, we find the essence of growth and the spark of transformation. For it is by acknowledging the dangers that we cultivate a profound appreciation for the untamed beauty that surrounds us, forever reminding us of our place within the grand tapestry of nature. And remember to tread carefully so that you can avoid an outdoor disaster.